Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Sheldon-Feld with the International Grief Institute, and this is Moments of Hope. Tonight, we are talking with Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas. Dr. Sally is an award-winning speaker and advocate on suicide prevention. She is, oh my goodness, you've got so many credentials. You're a White House speaker, and recently, you were on the Grammy stage. What was that about?
Oh, wow. It's one of those once in a lifetime things that all just came together. Logic was a Grammy nominated artist who wrote a song about the suicide prevention lifeline. And so those of us who were people with lived experience, people who had either losses or attempts in our lives who are also connected to the work of the Lifeline. I serve on the board, on the advisory board. We were invited to go up on stage with him and help celebrate this important moment for him and also for suicide prevention to really elevate that number into the public's consciousness. It was pretty wild.
That's fantastic. Where can we hear the song that he wrote?
Oh, it's everywhere. He named the song the Suicide Prevention Lifeline number, 1-800-273-8255. So it's everywhere. Logic, and then that number, and you'll find it. And it's his music video that he created to go with the song is actually very powerful. It depicts a young person who's struggling with thoughts of suicide and how he reaches out for help and gets to live through that moment and has a pretty incredible life after living through his suicide intensity.
That is powerful, and that's very profound. And so with regards to suicide, it's been in the media a lot lately because of Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, dying by suicide a couple of weeks ago. And it really shocked our nation. It's like, how does this happen? And so many media outlets are talking about suicide, which is fantastic on raising awareness. But tonight, I want to talk about one of your specialties, and that's suicide in the workplace. And, I want to tell our viewers that, you have lived through a loss of a loved one to suicide, your brother Carson, who died in 2004. And, we think of people who die by suicide as people who've been struggling for years, mental illness, sometimes they're, homeless, and just all these stereotypes. But your brother Carson was a huge athlete and a very successful professional. And so tell us about him for a minute before we talk about suicide in the workplace. What was he like?
Well, I mean, he was my brother, my only sibling. So, of course, I have this really sweet.
Oh, I think we froze. There we go.
He was, a father. He was a friend. He was a neighbor. He was a coworker. He had some pretty remarkable gifts and talents with his entrepreneurial drive and charisma and his ability to connect with people. But, he wasn't really that different from most other people in the world. He was a man who had, love and friends and success and challenges. And, he, in his last year, he did experience a pretty intense form of in their lives. And so he wasn't alone there. It just that his ended up being fatal, and it was absolutely heartbreaking. You and loved him.
Yeah, mental illness. You cut out there for a second on me, so I didn't hear what he'd been struggling with. But that's okay. But you were on the show with us last March, 3 months ago, and talked about Carson, and a remarkable story. And then he died by suicide, and so. Him being a professional, suicide in the workplace is on the rise. Why is that?
Well, we've known for a long time that suicide primarily hits the working age population. It's not something we tend to talk about, but when we look at both numbers and rates, it tends to be men and women in the working years that are hit the hardest. We mostly think of it as a youth issue, and certainly the journey into suicide can start with our young people, but for the most part, the largest numbers are in the workplace. So this isn't necessarily news, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been following a specific subset of that, which are suicide deaths that happen on a work site, which is a very, very small percentage of overall suicides that affect a workplace. So if you can imagine, most people who die by suicide do not take their lives on a work site. They take their lives in their homes or in other places. So that's just one small subset of people who die by suicide that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been tracking pretty regularly. I would also say that number is a gross underestimate of the number of people who die by suicide on a work site. Because again, if you can imagine, if you don't have a framework or a concept that perhaps this death might have been intentional, you are going to rule it as an accident. Where it doesn't take that much investigation. We call it a psychological autopsy. It doesn't take that much investigation to try to figure out what happened in the weeks and months leading up to that moment that would lead you to a far different conclusion than if you just looked at the death scene. And so we see this a lot right now in construction and in other places where fatalities on the work site are perhaps a little more common than in some other industries. And when I talked to the risk managers and the safety people, they were like, oh my gosh, like it's like this, they connect the dots. Like I always wondered why he didn't have his harness on or why he was up in this space all by himself. And like it never entered their consciousness before because they didn't think that it was a possibility. And so all the harness training in the world isn't going to protect those folks. It is really more about other types of prevention, other types of resilience and mental health promotion and suicide prevention that's going to protect that subgroup of people. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is one data point that we're looking at, one metric, but really, most people who die of suicide are working. They were just working. Maybe they just got laid off or retired, or they have a first degree family member who's working. So it makes sense that suicide prevention in the workplace is part of our overall public health strategy.
Right. And, again, we tend to think of people who die by suicide as those coping with mental illness, as well as teens, the teen group who, they have trouble looking past a particular angst in their life at the moment. And so a lot of, coverage is there. And so how long has it been where the bulk of suicides is with that middle-age number?
As long as we've been measuring.
Right?
We just don't want our kids to die of anything.
Right.
So when they die of anything, our focus goes in because like, wait a minute, they had 70 years, 90 years maybe of life in front of them. What happened? And we really pay attention. And when people get into midlife, there's a little bit more expectation that maybe you've lived some of your life. It's not as traumatic for communities as it is when it's kids. But yeah, as long as we've been measuring, it's been mostly for highest numbers. It's been people in the middle years. And then for increasing rates, especially the men in the middle years with less than a college education. So men in the middle years with less than a college education, we're seeing in the United States, not in all countries, but in the United States, we're seeing a pretty sharp upswing in the last few years that is incredibly concerning.
And so what do you think is behind that? What is
there's a couple of health economists that have been looking at this trend that's been going on for a couple of years. They've published a couple of pretty high profile pieces in major media, New York Times and Wall Street Journal and so forth. And their conclusion, so they've just been looking at the data and noticing that this trend is happening. It's been happening fairly consistently. And they said that this group of men had expectations. They had expectations, maybe working in the trades as construction or oil and gas, that they would have homes, that they would be able to retire, that their kids would go to college, that they would live the American dream. And when they get to midlife and they have some major job transitions and maybe are living through divorce, and all of a sudden those expectations, those dreams are crushed. So it's not everybody that comes into midlife with those expectations. There are certain subpopulations that never had those dreams. They were never modeled for them. But for this subpopulation, those expectations are, when they're crushed, it's devastating because most of their identity has been built upon role of provider. This is why I'm here. I'm here to provide for my family. And when they can't, and they can't see a way through it, they can't see a way through bankruptcy or the consequences of divorce or other types of health stressors, that level of stress hits them particularly hard.
And so, suicide often happens when pain exceeds coping skills.
That's a good way to put it.
And Absolutely. So with women, men are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide than women. And so does that translate into the workplace as well? Is it 3.5 times in the workplace, or are the numbers changed?
Nope, it's the same. Okay. The workplace really is just a public health system that we're looking at in terms of intervention. But the deaths and the attempts within the workplace are pretty representative of the population in general, because the population in general works. Women are not prevented from the despair of suicide. So we know that men are dying more, but women are attempting more. So women are also experiencing that despair. It's largely because men tend to choose more lethal means. They tend to choose firearms or hanging. They're less likely to survive their suicide attempts. Okay. Women are more likely to survive, which because the means that they choose give us the advantage of time. So they're more likely to attempt by overdosing, and there's a window of time between I engage in that behavior and the impact of my behavior. And often what happens in that window of time is that women either self-rescue or someone else rescues. And men who are choosing more lethal means do not have that opportunity. It's instant.
Right. There's no turning back.
Right, exactly.
There's no do-over. So with it happening more in the workplace, what can bosses and managers do for prevention?
Yeah. Well, this has been exciting for me because we've been championing, come on, workplace, get on board. Other systems are here, healthcare, education. We need you as part of this overall community-wide approach to making suicide a health and safety priority. And it's been really hard. I think the mental health community, so broader perhaps than suicide prevention, they have made some strides, but it's still been mostly stress reduction and what I would call mental health light. All important, very important for the overall picture. But if we're not talking about the hard stuff, we're also missing those conversations in really important places where we can make a difference. So I'm really excited to see groups like NAMI, National Alliance of Mental Illness, and Mental Health America, and the National Council for Behavioral Health really making progress and inroads into some fairly major corporations on how do we not only talk about coping and stress reduction and resilience, but also about depression and anxiety and trauma and substance use. And I would say the more courageous and more comprehensive groups are also talking about suicide prevention. We're seeing in industries where the suicide rates within those industries are fairly significantly higher and sometimes astronomically higher than the general population. So if the general population's suicide rate is between 12 and 13 per 100,000, we know that there are certain industries that are way above that. Farming, fishing, and forestry are about 84 per 100,000. So massively high suicide rates, but a relatively small industry. Right behind them is construction and extraction, about 54 per 100,000, and they are a massive industry. The construction just by itself, huge industry. So,
and extraction in gas, oil,
gas, mining, those kinds of industries, tend to hire a lot of stoic, brave mostly male employees that are willing to do things, willing to put themselves at risk to build us the things that we need in our community. So they are more likely, just because of the demographics that work there, but also because of the type of person that those industries employ. They're least likely to say, hey, I need some mental health services. It's just not part of the culture yet, but it's certainly getting there.
Right.
There's a huge culture of substance use. There's, just a lot of tough guy mentality that, is great for them to climb up on top of high buildings and build stuff or bridges or whatever, but it works against them when they are facing, the challenges of depression and trauma and substance use.
And suicide ideate, thinking about suicide. And
Absolutely.
So that's interesting that forestry and, that, why is that? Why would that be number one?
Again, this is a first pass on the data. So in the next couple of years, I'm going to say we'll have much better answers. But for those of us who've been thinking about this a lot, farming, fishing, and forestry also have those stoic, rugged individual, going to pull myself up by my bootstraps. We just manage stuff here. That kind of mentality. So not really likely to reach out. What they also have working against them when it comes to suicide prevention is they tend to be a very isolated demographic. So they're very alone, both geographically. They're in our rural and frontier and remote places. So it's very hard to get them to access services. But probably even more profound than that is that when they have hardship, when they fall per se, it's a long fall all by themselves. So they're usually all alone. With not a lot of peers or other people to talk to about what they're going through. And I think that part of that's the part of the equation that is the most difficult, because there's hardly any of us really that don't go through hard times in our lives, whether it's loss or, trauma or, other things. But when you have to go through them all alone, that's the part that can really cause challenges. That's right.
Yeah. And so, in talking about suicide, a lot of awareness has been raised about the connection between mental illness and suicide, but suicide doesn't always happen with mental illness. And
I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that, because I travel internationally to do this work and to learn, what other cultures and countries are doing. And I can tell you that the framework that we primarily operate in, that suicide is the result of a mental illness, is ours. It's not how the rest of the world really sees things. And it's not that people who die by suicide wouldn't have met criteria for some of our mental health categories. It's just that framework isn't always helpful for us understanding about what to do.
So why is the United States, pigeonholing it into mental illness? Because that's all we hear about. And that's not, I didn't realize that the rest of the world doesn't have that same link. And so, or belief system. And so is it because we're so uncomfortable talking about things that are, our own personal struggles? Why is the United States behind the other countries on this?
Oh, I don't know if we're behind. I think we've actually made tremendous amounts of strides for people who are living with mental health conditions to understand what we can do to help them. I just think that our framework is limited in appreciating what we can do. And actually, no one's ever asked me, why does the United States primarily see it through this lens? I don't know. Our thinking follows research, follows funding. So I guess it comes down to who's funding what. And maybe we maybe we appreciate some of the science around mental health stuff more than we do other public health issues. I don't know. It's a great question. But the consequences are that because it's our primary narrative, our primary solution is everybody's got to go to mental health treatment. Everybody got to go. Well, if you're a gay teen, and you're suicidal because your community is bullying you or marginalizing you, or, you can take antidepressants all dang day. You can have cognitive restructuring therapy all dang day. It's not going to solve your problem.
Right.
The problem isn't you. The problem is your community, all right? And we can do the same thing with any kind of other oppressive or marginalized group. Or, for example, divorce. Divorce is a common precursor. It's not the cause, but it is sometimes the straw that breaks the camel's back for people who are already vulnerable. They're already stressed. They're already not coping well. And then, separation happens within a relationship that they identified a lot with. And that can be the thing that leads them to think of suicide. And again, yes, we can get people into couples counseling and so forth. But if you're that stoic construction guy who the last place you're going to is mental health services, we got to have other systems in place that are going to be able to identify that you're struggling and get you support.
And one of those would be mantherapy.org, right? That's primarily why you set it up.
Yeah, I would say that's not a system, that's more of a resource that friends can use to reach out, or coworkers, or like a workforce development program. Anybody who's helping in that particular situation, that man go through whatever transition. I'm just speaking about men in the moment, but if it's a separation or a job transition, these are resources that can help these men kind of figure out, how bad is it? What kind of self-help can I get engaged with, or peers? What are resources available to me to get me through this? Right. The point of impact isn't usually going to be a mental health professional for the people most at risk for suicide. It's going to be a coworker, a friend, or a family member.
Okay. But, back to the workplace, there's so many different areas of this that we can go down, but back to the workplace, what can managers do? Whose responsibility is it to deal with this? It's a risk management issue.
If you can hear me. Okay, I got you. It's a public health issue that's everybody's responsibility. So I always equate it to CPR. Most workplaces value that employees learn CPR because, oh my gosh, if anybody has a major health crisis in the workplace, there should be somebody around who knows what to do. Right. And so we're going to train everybody. We're going to train them every year. So if somebody's got front of mind, I got this, and they're going to move in with confidence and competence. So that's one tactic that we can say, okay, we're doing this for, if somebody's choking in our break room. What if somebody's going through a major mental health crisis? Can we have the same mentality and say, let's train everybody on how to identify distress, how to have conversations with compassion, and how to collaboratively link people to the resources that we have to bear that will help support them. That's just one strategy that we work with workplaces on how to do this. We also work a lot on what we call upstream suicide prevention, which is really about building the protective factors within a workplace. And
I think
the throes of distress.
Sorry, you're freezing up.
It's another thing to build up the protective factors that prevent the distress from happening. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're cutting in and out, so no worries. And so when suicide in the workplace does happen, on the site, what resources are available for the coworkers, either those who witnessed it or those who were close with the employee that died by suicide? They're going to be traumatized, and they're also going to be dealing with traumatic grief. So what is out there for them at the moment? And do we see that increasing, those resources increasing?
So it doesn't have to be an employee's death on site that causes that same reaction. It certainly can be an employee's death that happened in their home, or even an employee's family member's death. Sometimes workplaces are so tightly knit that if someone's partner or child dies by suicide, it's like, one of your own nephews. It's that impactful. So a number of us from the Workplace Task Force from the National Action Alliance put together a manager's guide to suicide postvention. And it's really designed for that manager in crisis who's like, what do I do in the aftermath of this situation? And it walks them through flowcharts and checklists, templates for communication so that they can let other employees know this is what's happening here. It's very significant. We've got these supports for you. If it happens to be a quote unquote newsworthy suicide where maybe it's public or it's a high profile employee and the media is now involved, it gives those managers some guidelines on how to talk to the media in very safe and effective ways, how to provide practical assistance to employees who are bereaved, as well as, the long-term support. This is the kind of grief that tends not to go away very quickly. It's very complicated. And so, we give people 3 days often to, come back to work. And especially, I would say, with parents who've lost children, finding any kind of new normal where you're remotely functional takes a lot longer than 3 days. I would say for a lot of the parents that I've known, sometimes it's upwards of a decade. It's a long time. It's a long time. Yeah. So how do we provide accommodations like we would for other major health issues, like coming back from cancer or a major car accident? That's got to be the mentality for an employee who's coming back after this kind of catastrophic loss. And then, that's the epicenter. And then we make also arrangements for support and, less intense accommodations, but still a period of grief and trauma adjustment for people that are maybe not at the epicenter, but are needing more support in that transition of, what do we do moving forward? We lost a critical person in our work team. He was also a close friend, and not just brush it on by, because it turns out, when we respond in unsafe ways and unsupportive ways to suicide, we actually increase the risk that it happens again. So the post-vention stage is extremely important, that we come in with compassion and support, and also some awareness and sensitivity that there are ways to do this safe and effectively.
And so is sensitivity training something that corporate America has access to, especially in relation to suicide, whether on-site or not?
Yeah, I would say in the industries where suicide is happening more often, they are leaning in. I spend 60% of my time traveling around the country, speaking to construction professional associations, first responder groups, more recently transportation associations, so male-dominated industries where suicide is happening a lot, and they don't know what to do. Those groups are paying attention to not just the awareness training, but the skill building and the post-vention support and the upstream resilience building specifically related to suicide. I would say that most of the rest of workplaces, either this is not on their horizon at all. When they think about wellness, they think about nutrition and fitness, and they check a box and they're done.
Millions on wellness programs.
Yeah. But it's very limited. It's very specific about, how many steps you're taking and, stop smoking kinds of programs. And nobody's really got this particular part of wellness into their programs yet. If they do at all, it's what I refer to earlier as mental health light. And there's nothing wrong with it. I'm smiling because I'm grateful for it, but it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning of all the things that we could possibly do, like we do for other health issues. We're not afraid of some of the scarier stuff with other health issues, like cancer screening and cholesterol screening. It's not all, lift these weights and eat your fruits and vegetables. We're not afraid to go into some of the other, let's prevent these stage 4 things from happening to our employees. Same idea, but it's mental health and suicide instead of heart health and cancer.
So, it's interesting that the forestry and construction workers, that's the second largest industry where you're seeing suicide in the workplace. And we think of construction workers as the big, strong, again, you nailed it, stoic, they can do anything kind of thing. But is, suicide, how does that play into the resilience? Because if, they're big and strong, at least we think of them that way. That's a stereotype. But that inner resilience is just not there. Where is that weak link? How do we strengthen the resilience? What's that connection there?
So They are resilient, and they are strong, and they are courageous. What they often are not is deeply connected in a vulnerable way to other people in their support system.
Okay.
So what? And they're conditioned to think of themselves as strong and brave. So to go against that and say, I'm really falling apart, goes against the ethos of their community. So they white knuckle and they just hang on and they hope it passes. But like a lot of other health conditions, you get to a certain point, it doesn't pass, it just gets worse. And then they don't have a good safety net to fall into. So part of what we're trying to do, part of what's actually really working and working well, is building up a peer support culture within these kind of stoic, resilient, solve your own dang problems kind of workplaces. Okay. Because they do have a culture of, I've got your back, you've got my back, right? We have this in first responder communities, we have this in construction, in transportation. There's a sense of, I'm watching out for you, but it's mostly, so you don't die of a work-related injury. They haven't translated that yet into mental health, but it's not a far jump, which is why they are getting it quickly. So these peer support groups within firefighters and construction unions and transportation, it makes sense to them. They're like, I get this. What do I do? I don't want my buddy, my coworker to be struggling this way. How can I support them? And they're soaking it up so quickly. It's been very inspirational.
Fantastic. So what if an employee who is watching this right now is struggling with, considering suicide? What would you say to them? What resources can you offer them right now?
Oh, that's such a great question, because not all workplaces are created equal when it comes to this conversation. Many of our workplaces do have employee assistance programs, which are free. I mean, they pay for them, as you do pay for benefits, but they're mental services. And some of them are amazing. Like some of the employee assistance programs have very highly trained counselors who are very savvy to this kind of stuff, who can be incredible supports to help people through their darkest days. And some of our EAPs are not. They're not very good at all. They're pretty thin in terms of their benefit. So not in the moment of crisis, but I would make sure that workplaces are kicking the tires, is how I put it. Kick the tires of your EAP, because a lot of employers, they check the box. We have an EAP, we have this covered, and they don't really understand the quality of the services behind that. Okay. If you're an employee in crisis, I wouldn't put you through kicking the tires. You need support right away. And I would say your better bet is to call the very well vetted crisis response resources that are available to anyone. And one of those is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-8255. Those calls route to local crisis centers based on the area code of their phone. And everybody who answers those calls is highly trained on suicide de-escalation and knows the local resources. Another option is the crisis text line. Yeah. So you can text hello to 741-741 and get the same kind of services except through text instead of through the phone. Those are probably like what I would recommend at the top of the list. And then when you're not in crisis or have your manager or your safety trainer or your wellness provider, whomever that trusted role is within your workplace, go in and really check out those EAP services, because they can be incredibly helpful. And if they're not one of the better sorts of EAPs, it's worth it to advocate for an employee assistance program that is providing state-of-the-art services. Right. And then again, not in crisis. If you're not in crisis, I would really push forward and see if it's possible to start some kind of peer support. I really believe peer support is the link and the chain of survival that's often missing for people. Well-trained, supervised peers are often make the difference between life and death, not just in the workplace, but everywhere. Right. And so I love the text, to the suicide line there. Do you think men are more likely to engage in using text to reach out for help because it's a little more anonymous? Given the data that I know about, that's not necessarily the case,
okay.
Surprisingly. But that might change in 3 years or so. We'll see. But yeah, both are probable, the phone and text for both genders. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I love that they're staying, keeping up with technology. Texting is how many people communicate these days. So the fact that they offer that is fantastic.
And I would also just say, you don't have to be a person in crisis to use both of those resources. You can be a family member who's worried. You can be a supervisor who has questions.
Okay.
You can be a coworker who just noticed something and just wanted to check something out. In fact, everybody who answers those would prefer, you get upstream and like maybe you're not in a life and death situation, but you're just wondering. They would prefer you call then, because there's a lot more we can do when we're not in the, life and death crisis situation.
Right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sally, for joining us tonight and talking about this. It's, with suicide on the rise in the workplace, that's, no one ever thinks of that. And it is startling and alarming on so many levels. So thank you for opening the dialogue and filling us in. And I really appreciate all the work that you do for suicide advocacy, education, awareness, both with prevention and postvention. And congratulations for being on the Grammy stage.
Well, it's been an honor to be here with you tonight again. And thank you for opening up this conversation with your listeners. Many people in the workplace start in the grief state. So it's just know that there are resources for people who are bereaved by suicide. And if you are called, as I was, to do something, there are many opportunities to turn this into advocacy for suicide prevention. So thanks for connecting us.
Yeah, and so for if people want to reach out to you with more questions or want to know where they can get more information or resources, how can they reach you? Oh, I think we got frozen again.
I'm good. Can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay. So SallySpencerThomas.com is my website, and there you can connect to me a number of ways. You can join the newsletter. You can also connect with me to Facebook at Dr. Sally Speaks. I'm on Twitter at @SSpencerThomas, and I'm on LinkedIn. And any of those three ways will connect to me, and I would be more than appreciative to hear your questions, thoughts, and to support you if you're looking for resources or a way to help someone you care about.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Very appreciative of your time and grateful and for joining